It was November 1942. The night over Ironbottom Sound was black, thick, and heavy with rain clouds. No moon, no horizon. The sea and the sky blended into one dark surface, broken only by faint whitecaps and the dim silhouettes of warships moving without lights. The air was warm and damp, pressing down on men who had been awake for hours, some for days. Every sound carried. Every vibration through steel felt amplified. On the bridge of the battleship USS Washington, officers stared into darkness that offered no answers. Lookouts strained their eyes, knowing it would be useless. There was nothing to see. No enemy shapes, no gun flashes, no running lights. Only black water and the constant awareness that somewhere ahead, Japanese warships were closing. Radar had already spoken. The first returns were faint, then unmistakable, small glowing blips on a circular screen. Steady and real. Contacts, multiple, closing fast. The fleet had seconds. The American force was outnumbered, operating at night in restricted waters after weeks of brutal fighting around Guadalcanal. Fuel was limited, ammunition mattered, coordination was fragile. One wrong turn could put ships in each other's firing arcs. One delay could allow Japanese battleships to reach Henderson Field by dawn. If that happened, the airfield would be erased. If the airfield fell, Guadalcanal might fall with it. Everything hinged on minutes, maybe moments in the dark. The Battle of Guadalcanal had already dragged on for months by November. It had become a grinding struggle of attrition, fought by exhausted sailors, airmen, and Marines who understood that no single battle would decide the campaign, yet every night engagement carried strategic weight far beyond its size. Control of the waters around the island meant control of supply, reinforcement, and survival. For the U.S. Navy, the margin for error had shrunk to almost nothing. Earlier in the month, American cruisers and destroyers had suffered severe losses in night actions against Japanese forces, skilled in darkness, armed with long-range torpedoes, and trained extensively for close-quarters engagements under cover of night. Radar was still new. Its capabilities were powerful, but its interpretation depended on training, discipline, and trust in unseen data. Some officers believed in it completely. Others still trusted their eyes more. On Washington, radar was now the most important piece of equipment aboard. The task force had been assembled hastily. Rear Admiral Willis Lee Jr., a gunnery expert and former Olympic marksman, commanded the battleships Washington and South Dakota, supported by 4 destroyers. Lee understood radar. He trusted it. He had trained with it. He believed it could give the U.S. Navy an edge in night combat that it had not yet fully realized. But belief did not eliminate risk. The waters north of Guadalcanal were narrow and unforgiving. The Japanese force approaching was led by Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo, commanding a powerful bombardment group that included the battleship Kirishima, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers. Their mission was clear: reach the island, bombard Henderson Field, cripple American air power before daylight. American intelligence had pieced together fragments of Japanese movements, but nothing was certain. Radio silence limited communication. Weather interfered with air reconnaissance. Every decision was made with incomplete information. As night fell on November 14, the American ships moved into position, engines turning slowly, wakes kept minimal. The destroyers took station ahead, intended to make first contact and disrupt any Japanese advance. Behind them, the battleships followed, dark and silent, guns trained forward. On Washington, Captain Glenn B. Davis stood alert, aware that his ship represented one of the most powerful concentrations of naval firepower in the Pacific: 9 16-inch guns, thick armor, radar-controlled fire control systems that had never been tested in a full-scale night battle against capital ships. No one knew how it would play out. Below decks, men waited at their stations. Turret crews stood by massive shells, each weighing over a ton. Fire control teams monitored scopes and plotting tables. Radar operators watched their screens, tracking contacts that could not be seen by human eyes. Time stretched. Then, the radar picture sharpened. At approximately 2300 hours, the destroyers ahead made contact. Radar showed enemy ships crossing the American path. Almost immediately, the night exploded into action. Gunfire flashed. Star shells burst overhead, briefly illuminating water and steel before darkness swallowed everything again. The destroyers charged in, firing torpedoes, engaging at close range. The exchange was chaotic. Japanese ships responded with accurate fire. One American destroyer was hit and slowed. Another disappeared into smoke and flame. On Washington, Admiral Lee watched the unfolding engagement with mounting concern. The destroyer screen was being torn apart faster than anticipated. Radio reports were fragmentary, often cut off mid-sentence. Radar contacts multiplied, overlapped, then vanished in interference and clutter. The situation was deteriorating. The battleships continued forward, careful not to outrun their support, but aware that delay favored the enemy. Every minute allowed the Japanese to press closer to Guadalcanal. Then, something went wrong. USS South Dakota, steaming just ahead into port of Washington, began to experience electrical failures. One by one, circuits went down. Radar flickered. Communications faltered. Fire control systems dropped offline. The ship was still moving, still armed, but blind and partially deaf in the middle of a night surface engagement. On Washington, the implications were immediate and alarming. Formation integrity mattered in night combat. Mutual support mattered even more. A blind battleship was vulnerable not only to the enemy, but to collision, confusion, and friendly fire. Radar showed South Dakota drifting slightly out of position. Admiral Lee had seconds to assess. Japanese contacts were now clearly visible on the radar scope, multiple large returns. One, in particular, stood out. A battleship-sized target, steady, bearing down at a range of roughly 18,000 yards. That contact was Kirishima. The Japanese had not yet detected Washington. In the darkness, with South Dakota drawing attention through gun flashes and searchlights, Washington remained unseen. Her radar was clear. Her fire control system was intact. Her guns were ready. Radar spoke again. The range closed. On South Dakota, confusion intensified. Electrical failures caused intermittent lighting across the ship. At moments, the superstructure was briefly illuminated, silhouetted against the dark. Japanese lookouts spotted her. Searchlights snapped on. Heavy shells began to fall. South Dakota took hits. The impacts were loud, jarring, and damaging antennas, wrecking equipment, but not penetrating vital armor. Still, the ship's position became increasingly precarious. On Washington, Admiral Lee made his decision. He ordered his ship to turn slightly, opening a clear firing arc while keeping distance from South Dakota. The maneuver was precise, calculated, and risky. Too close, and the battleship risked entanglement in the chaos. Too far, and the opportunity might be lost. The radar range dropped below 16,000 yards. Fire control solutions tightened. The target's course and speed were plotted with growing confidence. Bearings stabilized. The radar return was clean and unmistakable. This was the moment radar had been built for. Yet, no one aboard Washington had ever fired 16-inch guns at an enemy battleship guided solely by radar. Doctrine allowed it. Training had prepared them, but theory and reality were not the same. The ship's gunnery officer confirmed the solution. Admiral Lee gave the order. At 0:05 on November 15, 1942, USS Washington opened fire. The first salvo thundered across the water, 9 massive shells arcing invisibly into the night. There was no visual confirmation, no splash could be seen, only radar could tell the story now. Seconds passed. Then the radar operator reported changes. The target return shifted, distorted, then steadied again. The second salvo followed. On Kirishima, the impact was sudden and devastating. Shells struck the superstructure and hull, tearing through steel, knocking out power, wrecking steering, igniting fires. Japanese lookouts had no warning. No muzzle flashes had betrayed Washington's position. The attack came out of the dark, precise and overwhelming. On Washington, radar confirmed hits. The range closed further. Another salvo fired. The Japanese battleship began to slow. Meanwhile, South Dakota continued to absorb enemy attention. Japanese cruisers and destroyers concentrated fire on her, mistaking her for the primary threat. Shells splashed around her hull. Some struck home. The ship shuddered but stayed afloat. Washington remained invisible. Radar spoke again. Kirishima's return faltered. Fire control adjusted. Another full salvo roared out. This time, the target returned fragmented. The Japanese battleship's speed dropped sharply. She was crippled. But the battle was not over. Other Japanese ships were still present. Torpedoes had been launched earlier. The water ahead could be filled with unseen threats. Japanese destroyers were maneuvering aggressively. Smoke and confusion obscured friend from foe. Admiral Lee had to decide whether to continue pressing the attack or withdraw before the situation turned against him. Radar showed additional contacts. Some were closing. Some were turning away. The American destroyers were largely gone, either sunk, damaged, or disengaged. South Dakota was battered and vulnerable. Washington was alone in effective fighting condition. The Japanese still had weapons left. Admiral Lee ordered a temporary ceasefire. The silence was heavy. Radar operators watched intently. Kirishima was now dead in the water, burning, listing. Her fate was sealed, but other enemy ships remained the danger. On Washington, the bridge crew listened for orders, eyes fixed on instruments rather than the darkness beyond the rails. The fleet still had seconds. Radar spoke one more time. New contacts appeared, maneuvering rapidly. The situation was unresolved, and the night was far from over. The radar returns did not disappear. They shifted. They separated, then merged again, as Japanese ships reacted to the sudden loss of their battleship. Some contacts slowed. Others accelerated hard to the north and west. A few turned directly toward USS Washington, probing, uncertain, aggressive. Admiral Willis Lee stood quietly on the bridge, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed not on the night outside, but on the radar plot being updated in real time. The silence after the ceasefire was unsettling. The guns had stopped, but the danger had not. This was the most dangerous moment. The Japanese now knew an American battleship was present. They did not yet know where. Smoke from Kirishima drifted across the water, masking movement and distorting radar returns. The water was confined. Torpedoes, if already in the water, would give no warning. Every second mattered. On South Dakota, the situation was grim. The ship was still afloat, still maneuvering, but many of her systems remained offline. Communications were unreliable. Radar was ineffective. She had been hit repeatedly, not catastrophically, but enough to degrade combat effectiveness. Antennas were down. Fire control was damaged. Her silhouette, intermittently lit by burning debris and searchlights, had drawn the full attention of Japanese gunners. Captain Thomas Gatch fought to regain control of his ship, ordering damage control teams into darkened compartments, rerouting power where possible. The crew worked under pressure, aware that another concentrated salvo could change everything. On Washington, Admiral Lee understood that South Dakota could not sustain another engagement alone. He also understood that lingering too long risked encirclement. Radar showed Japanese cruisers turning away from Kirishima, retreating northward. Destroyer contacts zigzagged, their movements erratic, possibly launching torpedoes, possibly searching. Lee made his choice. He ordered Washington to maneuver away from the densest cluster of contacts, increasing distance while maintaining radar coverage. The goal was survival, not pursuit. The Japanese bombardment mission had already failed. Henderson Field would not be shelled this night. That alone made the engagement a strategic success. The battleship increased speed. The screws churned the black water, unseen, unheard beyond a short distance. Washington turned gradually, careful not to silhouette herself against fires burning to the south. The radar picture adjusted smoothly, tracking contacts that grew fainter as range increased. Kirishima remained visible on radar, her return now irregular, drifting, barely moving. She was no longer a threat, but the night still belonged to uncertainty. Japanese doctrine emphasized aggressive night action. Destroyers were trained to attack capital ships with torpedoes, closing under cover of darkness. The infamous Type 93 long-lance torpedo had exceptional range and lethality. Even a single hit could cripple a battleship. Lee knew this. He ordered a zigzag pattern, complicating any torpedo solution. Speed was adjusted slightly, then again, enough to alter course without sacrificing control. The crew remained at battle stations. The guns stayed trained, though silent. Minutes passed. Radar contacts thinned. One by one, Japanese ships disengaged, retreating north toward the shoreland islands. Some attempted to screen Kirishima, others simply fled. The battle had lasted less than an hour. Its effects would echo for months. At approximately 0030 hours, Admiral Lee judged the immediate threat reduced. He ordered Washington to slow and hold position temporarily, maintaining radar watch while assessing South Dakota's condition. Radio communication was attempted again. This time, fragments came through. South Dakota was damaged, but afloat. Casualties were significant, but contained. Propulsion remained functional. The ship could withdraw on her own power. Relief spread across Washington's bridge, but it was muted. The night had not yet fully passed. Submarines were a possibility. Air attack would come with daylight. Fuel considerations loomed. Ammunition had been expended, though not dangerously so. And somewhere nearby, Kirishima still burned. Japanese damage control teams fought desperately aboard the crippled battleship. Fires raged amidships. Steering was jammed. Flooding increased. Attempts to rig emergency control failed. The ship listed further as the hours passed. By early morning, it was clear she could not be saved. Japanese destroyers evacuated survivors. Shortly after dawn, Kirishima capsized and sank. She became the only Japanese battleship sunk by American battleship gunfire during World War II. But the men aboard Washington did not witness that moment. They were already withdrawing, turning south and east, conscious that daylight would bring new dangers. American air power was dominant by day, but Japanese aircraft still posed threats, especially to damaged ships. South Dakota struggled southward, escorted, her superstructure scarred, her systems slowly coming back online. Damage control crews continued their work hour after hour, restoring power, patching cables, tending to the wounded. The battle off Guadalcanal was not over. Even as Washington disengaged, other American naval forces clashed with Japanese ships in separate engagements. Aircraft launched from Henderson Field struck retreating enemy vessels. The Japanese reinforcement effort faltered, then collapsed. By November 15, it was clear that Japan had failed to dislodge American forces from Guadalcanal. The night action in Ironbottom Sound had been decisive, but its significance went beyond a single sunk battleship. For the U.S. Navy, the engagement marked a turning point in night combat doctrine. Radar, used decisively and confidently, had allowed an American battleship to strike first, accurately and invisibly. The Japanese advantage in night fighting had been broken, not by luck, but by technology integrated with disciplined command. Admiral Lee's calm reliance on radar, his restraint in maneuver, and his refusal to be drawn into chaotic close-range fighting preserved his force and achieved the mission. Yet, the cost was real. American destroyers had been lost. Lives had been lost. The waters around Guadalcanal remained littered with wreckage, oil slicks, and debris from weeks of relentless combat. As dawn broke on November 15, the sea revealed what the night had concealed. Burned-out hulks, floating debris, the scars of battle etched into steel and water alike. For the men who had lived through the night, exhaustion set in only after safety seemed assured. Adrenaline faded, the weight of survival pressed down. Many had been at battle stations for more than 24 hours, fueled by tension rather than sleep. On Washington, Admiral Lee finally allowed himself to sit. He removed his glasses briefly, rubbing his eyes, then replaced them. There would be reports to write, questions to answer, lessons to capture while memories were fresh. He knew history had shifted, quietly in the dark. Radar had spoken first, and the fleet had listened. But the broader battle for Guadalcanal still demanded attention. Japanese forces would continue to attempt resupply and evacuation under cover of darkness. American air and naval units would continue to intercept. The campaign would grind on, though momentum had turned. For now, Washington steamed away, unscathed, her guns silent, her radar still scanning, ready to speak again if needed. The moment had passed. The consequences were only beginning to unfold. Dawn came slowly over Ironbottom Sound. The light revealed what the night had hidden. Calm water broken by wreckage, oil slicks spreading in thin iridescent layers, and distant smoke rising from places where ships had fought and died. The sea looked deceptively peaceful, but nothing about it was settled. USS Washington continued southward, her radar still active, her crew still at battle stations. No one relaxed, no one assumed safety. The Pacific War had taught the U.S. Navy that victory at night did not guarantee survival by day. Japanese aircraft could still appear, submarines could still be waiting, and damaged ships moved slowly. On South Dakota, the sun exposed the scars of the night. Her superstructure was battered, antennas twisted, cables hanging loose. Gun directors were shattered. Compartments were blackened from fires now extinguished. Yet the hull remained intact. The engines turned. The ship lived. Captain Thomas Gatch ordered a detailed damage assessment as daylight allowed fuller inspection. Electrical crews worked methodically, restoring systems one circuit at a time. Medical teams tended to the wounded, quietly, efficiently. There was no celebration, only focus. The ship had survived by margins measured in feet and seconds. As the morning progressed, American aircraft from Henderson Field appeared overhead. Their presence was reassuring. Fighters circled, scanning the sea. Bombers ranged northward, searching for retreating Japanese ships. The balance of power had shifted decisively with the coming of daylight. Far to the north, Japanese destroyers completed the evacuation of survivors from Kirishima. The once proud battleship, crippled beyond recovery, had already slipped beneath the surface. Her loss was acknowledged quietly within the Japanese fleet. There would be no attempt to re-engage. The bombardment mission had failed completely. For the first time since the campaign began, Japanese naval commands recognized that Guadalcanal could not be retaken by surface action alone. The implications were severe. Throughout the morning of November 15, reports filtered in across American command channels. Airstrikes had damaged or sunk additional Japanese ships. Transports meant to reinforce ground forces had been destroyed or forced to turn back. The flow of supplies to Japanese troops on Guadalcanal had been cut again. For American forces ashore, the night battle meant survival. Henderson Field remained operational. Aircraft continued to fly. The Marines held their lines. The importance of that outcome could not be overstated. Guadalcanal had been the first major American offensive in the Pacific. Failure there would have delayed the entire Allied advance. Success meant momentum, experience, and proof that the Imperial Japanese Navy could be challenged and beaten. At sea, Washington and South Dakota proceeded towards safer waters. Escorting destroyers joined them. Fuel status was monitored carefully. Ammunition tallies were checked and rechecked. The ships were no longer in immediate danger, but the war offered no true rear area. On Washington, Admiral Willis Lee gathered his senior officers. There was no speech, no ceremony, only a review of actions taken, decisions made, and observations noted. Lee was methodical. He understood that what had occurred was unprecedented. Radar-directed battleship fire had worked, not in theory, in reality. For decades, naval combat doctrine had emphasized visual contact, range estimation, and coordinated maneuvers based on sight. Radar had been introduced rapidly, under wartime pressure, and its full potential was still being debated. Some commanders treated it as a supplement. Others saw it as transformative. Lee belonged firmly in the second group. The engagement had validated his belief, but he also recognized the fragility of success. Had South Dakota's electrical failures occurred earlier or aboard Washington instead, the outcome might have been very different. Had Japanese destroyers pressed their torpedo attacks more aggressively, the balance could have shifted. Had radar operators misinterpreted returns, the opening salvos might have missed. The margin between victory and disaster had been narrow. As reports moved up the chain of command, the significance of the battle became clearer. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the South Pacific area, reviewed the engagement carefully. He understood what it meant, not just tactically, but strategically. The Japanese had lost a battleship. They had failed to neutralize Henderson Field. Their surface fleet had withdrawn. The Americans had held the line. In Tokyo, the loss of Kirishima was painful, but secondary to the broader realization that the Guadalcanal campaign was slipping away. Japanese naval planners had believed night superiority would offset American industrial and numerical advantages. That belief had been shaken. Radar had changed the equation. In the days that followed, the battle was analyzed repeatedly. Gunnery officers studied firing data. Radar specialists reviewed scope recordings and operator notes. Damage reports from South Dakota were examined in detail, leading to changes in electrical system redundancy and combat survivability. Lessons were absorbed quickly. Training programs were adjusted. Doctrine evolved. The U.S. Navy did not declare victory loudly. It simply adapted. On Guadalcanal itself, Japanese ground forces began to suffer increasingly severe shortages. Without reliable naval support, they struggled to move food, ammunition, and reinforcements. American air power dominated daylight hours. Naval patrols dominated the waters by night. By February 1943, Japan would evacuate its remaining forces from the island. Guadalcanal would be secure. The night action of November 14-15 did not end the campaign alone, but it made the end inevitable. For the men who had fought aboard Washington and South Dakota, the battle became a defining memory, not because of spectacle, but because of discipline, because of restraint, because of trust in unseen data and measured decision-making under pressure. Years later, historians would note that USS Washington had achieved something unique. She had engaged and destroyed an enemy battleship in a surface action without being detected visually. Her guns had spoken through radar alone. The engagement marked a quiet revolution in naval warfare. But at the time, there was no sense of revolution. Only relief, only exhaustion, only the knowledge that they had survived another night. As Washington eventually returned to port, her crew resumed routines that felt strangely normal. Maintenance, watch rotations, meals eaten quickly, letters written home, careful in their wording, vague in detail. No one aboard knew how history would remember their actions. They only knew that the fleet had held, that radar had spoken first, and that seconds had been enough. The Pacific War would continue for nearly 3 more years. Bigger battles would come. Carrier clashes would dwarf surface engagements in scale and consequence. New technologies would emerge. Old ones would fade. But in November 1942, in the darkness off Guadalcanal, a single moment had revealed the future. Steel guided by unseen waves. Decisions made without sight. Victory achieved before the enemy understood what was happening. The night belonged to radar, and from that night forward, naval warfare would never be the same.